got back to the United States in early 2004, and he was on his way. He was involved in the re-election campaign, and there were already discussions about his military service and some discussions a little bit about John Kerry's military service. And I thought, boy, in spite of the already growing evidence that they cooked up this weapons of mass destruction stuff, he looks like he may get back in again. And I thought that was so amazing. And I said, well, let me do some research on him and see if there's anything more we can understand. And I began traveling around the country, and I often do this in a very impractical way, as my mother always points out to me, because I never have any money. I just took what little I had and I began traveling and visiting all kinds of places and talking to people, many of whom I didn't know, asking them, how do you explain Bush? And is there anything more behind this? And everybody gave me, they all, a lot of the answers seemed smug. People were like, it's Karl Rove, or it's how stupid the American people are, or it's this or it's that, but there really didn't seem to be any consensus, and it didn't even seem to me that anybody had thought that deeply on this important sort of philosophical question, if you will. And so I just kept looking, and one thing I stumbled into, I started looking at his military service record, because it became clear to me that there was no understanding on this, and here was a man who had elected to go into an unnecessary war, and not only was this causing tremendous havoc with the reputation of the United States, the safety of Americans, certainly the safety of the troops, certainly the safety of the people living in those countries, but also he was sending thousands of National Guardsmen to Iraq, and quite a few of them were injured or died, and we interviewed those people, and they were poorly trained. They were not ready for that sort of combat, and in fact, when you joined the National Guard, historically, I don't know, has anybody here been in the National Guard? Okay. Well, if the history of the National Guard is it's pretty much they're state institutions actually, and what you really do is you help in emergencies, usually natural disasters. You're piling up sandbags when the banks of the Mississippi are in danger of overflowing, and so people who join the National Guard reasonably don't expect to be sent into military action abroad. And that's why I think George W. Bush joined the National Guard instead of going to Vietnam, even though he and his family were big supporters of the Vietnam War, as long as somebody else's kids went there. And so I thought this was a topic that was about more than just whether or not he had served. And so I began looking into that. The result of that was several articles I did for The Nation about really, I think, pretty definitively showing that the real reason he had left his unit 2 years short was not the way that they had been presenting it at these White House press conferences, that he had this great opportunity to be a campaign manager, assistant campaign manager in an Alabama campaign, and that's why he'd left and supposedly joined a unit in Alabama, and even though nobody could remember him seeing him there ever doing drills, and even though there was no record of him doing drills, that somehow he had sort of invisibly completed those final 2 years. And so this just, as I began looking at that, I began seeing the hand of his father in what appeared to be a cover-up of this. And I thought, boy, and we hear that the father and the son don't get along, and the son is so different than the father, and I thought, this is interesting. I mean, this is the father really being very close with the son. And I looked in all the books, and all the books about the son, all the books about the father, and none of them mentioned the father at all in this period. And I thought, well, the father was the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations this period, and then he went on to become the head of the Republican Party in this period. And so if the father, in fact, was involved in covering up his son's failure to complete his military service, which would probably be a felony with no statute of limitations, obviously they considered that to be important. Obviously the father and the son were certainly close in that period. And what I discovered was that to understand what has happened in this country, you needed to study the relationship between the father and the son. And that is, to a large extent, what Family of Secrets is about. The first half is about the father, mostly, and the second half is about the son, mostly. And what I'll do is I'll just read a little bit from the book here and there, and then we'll go to questions, because I think that the questions are where people really get a chance to focus in on what's important for them. Family of Secrets is 500 and some pages. It's got 1,000 footnotes. It has a lot of explosive material, but I was very, very careful to couch it in terms that I consider to be responsible, to not overstate what I could not overstate. And I draw some conclusions, but I also invite readers to think for themselves and see what they make of it. I have to tell you, by the way, a number of people have told me that they had to read the book twice to really come to terms with what is in it. And I have to say that after I finished it and hadn't looked at it a number of months, I began reading it again, preparing to do the various shows that I've been on, and I found that I could only read sort of a few pages at a time and had to stop almost in shock. I felt like almost I was reading someone else's book, and I was astounded at sort of what I put together, because you sort of forget when you're busy dealing with all the details. So anyway, looking at the son, looking at the father, I realized that that the son would never have been president had the father not been president. They're both named George Bush. Amazingly, some polls even found that a certain percentage of the American populace thought the son was the father running for office again, miraculously. I mean, apparently that's what they found. And so the son certainly, based on his rather thin resume, would not have had much of a chance on his own to run for president. Whatever you want to say of the contenders, they all have a lot of experience in government or law, or even people who came up more quickly like Obama are very bright and talented speakers and so on. And so here was this fellow who really didn't measure very high on any of these charts, and it's pretty clear that it was based on his father's network and his father's name and track record. So I began looking at the father. The first things that struck me about the father was, I was like, well, how did the father become president? And I started sort of looking at all the books that mentioned him, and I realized none of the books ever made a case for why this man really should have been president. The father, if you go back and you try to remember what he was like, he also was a pretty poor communicator. He mangled sentences. Do you remember that? And he had all those embarrassing incidents. He once was sort of asked to kind of expound on his philosophy, and he said he wasn't that good at that vision thing. And so, I mean, the father really was a bit of a cipher too. And so I began looking at the father, and I found a number of strange things, one of which was the father saying that somebody had asked him where he was on November 22, 1963. I presume the reporter was just sort of asking lots of different politicians that, and he could not remember where he was. And I thought that was so strange, and I think... see, how many of you were alive in 1963? Okay. And how many of you who were alive then don't remember where you were?